Hi, my name is Chris Osborn, and I am the principal and founding member of Osborn Conflict Resolution, which is a law firm here in Charlotte, North Carolina, that provides collaborative law and mediation services to families and businesses who are undergoing serious challenges and possible breakup or dissolution. And I get frequent referrals from friends of mine and folks that I know in the community, folks that I've worked with in the past, when a couple is on the very front end of considering what is going on with their family and how it might lead to a separation and possibly ultimately a divorce, not always. And sometimes the couples I work with and refer to are actually not married, but maybe cohabitating. And they've got children together, they've got businesses together, things like that. And when that relationship doesn't look like it's going to survive, they've got to find a way to disentangle as well. And when I'm contacted early enough in the process, I love to be able to try to help guide people through this very difficult situation and try to help them be able to understand that they have a number of different options. If this is where you find yourself in this very unfortunate place, there are many different ways, forms of dispute resolution, and ways that you can go about navigating the challenging time that you're going to be facing. And so I've got this little presentation here that I like to have people watch so that they both get the same information and that they both have an opportunity to consider the information and talk about together before either of them chooses whether to hire our firm or anybody else as a lawyer or as a mediator. And so I'm going to walk through this little presentation here that kind of goes over what has to be dealt with in separation and goes over what your options are for dealing with it, which is where I'll spend most of the time. I do need to give a disclaimer. This is not actual legal advice. And just by watching this, we're not creating any kind of attorney-client relationship. This is simply informative communication that helps people understand their options. And then if somebody wanted to actually hire our law firm again as a mediator or as a collaborative lawyer to assist, that's the main services we provide. And if you wanted to hire us, then that would be a process that we would go through specifically that I'll talk about in the end. So as I mentioned, starting off, and I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller here so that I don't interfere with the presentation. A marriage starts off basically with celebration and excitement and happiness. And I don't know how long ago it was for you, but whenever you got married, it was a positive, joyous occasion most of the time, or when you decided to move in together for that matter. And at that point in time, you thought you were starting off on your life together and that you'd be heading off into the future together. So I've kind of got, this is going to be a little bit of a metaphor here. I've got some visual images I use here because some people respond to or are spoken to more, educated more by visual images. And so even though it's kind of it looks a little bit cartoony, it's not to make light of the situation at all. It's just kind of a way to have a visual representation that's helpful for some people. So think of it as a metaphor in the sense that when you started your relationship together, you got on a ship together and you were headed out basically onto the open sea. And you said, where I go, you'll go, and we're going together and we're getting through this for life. If you find yourself now watching this video because you're considering separation or your spouse or significant others considering separating, there's been a major detour and the ship isn't going where you thought it was. And that's a hard and difficult thing to have to deal with. And the metaphor I like to use is basically your ship has essentially, rather than staying on the course that you all thought it was headed on, it's run aground. And it's run aground in a place that I have named for purposes of being able to have a metaphor to work with, Separation Island. And again, that's not to make light of it or to make it into a game. It's very serious business. The Separation Island is basically the reason the metaphor is helpful is because this is where you are. If either of you is separating, has moved out, is considering moving out, if either of you wants to separate, then you will be separated. And sometimes one spouse chooses it and the other is, what? I didn't know what happened. I don't want this. Other times spouses come or significant others come to that agreement together and they say, yes, we need to separate, and they jointly pursue it. But either way, if one or the other of you decides that you want to separate, then you are going to run aground on Separation Island. And separation, as defined under the law of North Carolina, is very simple. It is a legal status, yes. It's commenced simply by the act of either party, either the husband or the wife, or husband in the case of a same sex marriage, leaving the marital home with the intent to leave the marriage, at least temporarily, and with the intent to get some space, whatever. The physical moving out is what sets that process in motion. And it becomes very important because that date of separation is a factor that is used to measure the value of different accounts and things that we'll get into later. And my point is simply, I've had folks come to me and say, well, can we get separated and live in the same house? And the answer is no, not in North Carolina. It doesn't matter what your intention is or what your stated purposes are, sleeping in separate bedrooms. That doesn't commence a legal separation under North Carolina law. But if somebody moves out, even if it's just to go stay with a friend or just to go live with a relative or something like that, if they don't intend to come back and they don't come back to the relationship, then a separation has commenced. And so technically, that means you are on Separation Island. And what we're going to talk about is, what does that mean? And so the three questions we're going to look at are, where are we now? And the answer is very simple. It's Separation Island. We're going to talk about the lay of the land, what it means. Where are we going? Which is kind of the bigger picture. Okay, now that you're here, you're run aground on Separation Island. What has to be dealt with? What are the choices that you have to make? You might have thought of some of them. You might have some of them leap immediately to mind, and others you might not be as aware of. And then the place I want to spend the most time is, how are we going to get there? Because that is the most important thing. How you guys are going to navigate Separation Island, and then how you're going to leave Separation Island, one way or the other, are things that are important to think about right now. And they're hard to think about because you're still in the throes of absorbing that this is happening, that these dreams have died, and that reality is in this very dark, difficult place. So turning to the kind of where are we going question, if either party initiates separation, if either of you moves out, you are here on Separation Island. This does not mean that you're necessarily getting divorced. Lots of folks, and I have several friends I know, in fact, who have gotten separated, but they decide, you know what, they get some healing, they work on some things, they deal with some addictions or some relationship issues, and they decide we can resume this marriage. And they basically reconcile. I've known separations to last as short as a few weeks to 6 months. I've known a few people who've actually gotten divorced and gotten remarried, but that's a whole different story. But just because you're here and you separate doesn't mean the die is cast as far as divorce. Anytime, if you all decide to go get back on the SS marriage together, if you decide to resume the relationship, then you can leave Separation Island and resume as you were before. You'll also, if you resume the relationship, if one of you moves out, then you come back home and you start acting like married couples again and having physical interactions, things like that, then you'll be considered to have resumed the marriage. And the fact that you separated before kind of is forgotten, and you'd have to separate again to start the clocks over again and start the process over again. And the reason I reference the clocks is because the other way that you leave Separation Island is if you do ultimately get divorced. And the way divorce works in North Carolina, there's only one grounds for divorce, and that is you have to be physically separated for 1 year without intent to resume the marriage. And so that's the thing that's hard for people to grasp a lot of times, particularly in North Carolina, because it's longer than other states. If you're here for a year before actual divorce happens. And a divorce means at the end that the marriage bond is, of course, broken. And then what happens from there is you all would each get in different boats and leave the island. You don't leave the island together if you're getting divorced. However, as we'll talk about, there's a little bit more complication to that. And we'll talk about kind of how you get there. But again, the actual legal divorce is the easiest part of the whole process. It's, if you see those signs by the side of the road or seen ads that say divorce for $400, this is all they mean, is we'll do the filing and get the actual divorce papers entered. Again, that's the simplest, most administrative part of the process. And you can't actually even ask for it until the separation has lasted for a year. So that's why I liken separation islands. Basically, this is where you're going to be for some period of time, and up to a year if you're going to be divorced. You're going to be in this realm of place where you are separated. And as I put on the screen, there are several things that you have to take care of and you have to provide for while you're here. First and foremost, if you have children, and not all couples who are separating and divorcing do, but if you have children, then you've got to come up with what your arrangements are for child custody and visitation. I'm not going to go into the details of it here. I'm just going to highlight that that's often the first and foremost thing on people's minds. We've established a separate household. One of us is moving out. Who's going to see the kids when? Who's going to get them to school? And when is the other parent who might not have them on school nights going to have their time with them? So that is something you have to work out during the separation time. You might agree to it. You might fight it out. We'll talk about your options in just a minute. If there are children also, that means child support is probably going to be an issue. And again, I'm not going to go into the weeds of child support in this presentation. It is a factor that has to be determined. If, say, there's a couple, they have 3 kids, husband moves out, the wife is going to be probably buying most of the groceries for the kids directly. Husband would normally be contributing to that purchase. And now there's got to be some arrangement. Well, how is that going to happen? Sometimes couples can work together well in sharing finances when they're separated, and sometimes it's a battle. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes there's not a lot of trust. But child support and child custody are usually what is on people's mind most strongly when a divorce is happening, if there are children, or when a separation is happening, because the welfare of the kids has to be provided for while you're on the island during this year at least. Spousal support is a separate issue. This comes up if you do or don't have kids. And spousal support has 2 different varieties, and you may have heard of these varieties. One is called post-separation support. And post-separation support means now that we're separated, sometimes both couples or both members of a couple have gainful employment or employed earning money. Sometimes there's only one breadwinner. Sometimes one earns a lot more money than the other. That's fairly typical. So there's got to be a way basically for how all the costs of living for both households are going to happen while you're on the island. That's what post-separation support is. And again, something can be agreed to or fought over. Alimony is a term that you hear people talk about a lot as well. It's very related to post-separation support, and it is considered in light of a lot of the same factors of relative income and other resources that you have. The key thing to remember about alimony, though, is alimony is really a bigger picture question. Alimony is about, well, after we leave the island and wife is on her shift and husband's on his shift, after you leave the island, is there going to be any money paid by the partner who made more money to support the other person for a period of time, either while they're getting new employment, getting on their feet? It's separate from the needs and expenses of taking care of the children, because that's handled by child support. And then there's a third, or another component here, another circle that I've got here that has to be considered. So alimony is not something that has to be decided right out of the gate. It's more decided as you're leaving the island if it is any divorce. And there's a whole lot of factors. I'm not going to go into the details of that. That'll be another video probably at some point in time. The last item you might have heard about, though, is the idea of equitable distribution, which is basically the property settlement. If you've owned property together, if you've purchased property together, there's a process basically for identifying what assets you own and what debts you have incurred as of the date of separation. The date of separation is a really important date because it's the date that we have to have one that we choose to value everything that you own. And the idea is equitable distribution. Basically, in North Carolina, the presumption is the assets and debts are both going to be split up 50-50 in terms of total value. How do you get there in terms of what is given to one person in kind, we would say, such as like a car, for example, how you do that versus dividing up the money in an account or dividing up a retirement account, which is another whole complicated situation. In terms of making sure everybody's got the liquidity, the available cash, if there is cash, or has investments or value. Some couples don't have a lot. Some couples have a house. but it's mainly debt, and there might be some equity in it, some upside in it. And again, the details of equitable distribution I'll leave for another time. The point is, you don't have to figure out equitable distribution until you know, yes, divorce is happening, and you're going to be loading up each what you're taking from the marriage onto your respective ships and sailing off. So you can separate and start dealing with all the other financial issues on the island before you have to deal with equitable distribution. And so if you would look and you see these two ships are going to be leaving with what each person gets. So that's equitable distribution in a nutshell. Now, let me introduce one other thought and then speak to one other thing before this video concludes, and that's this. These two ships, basically, once divorce happens, there's some couples are like, can't wait, good riddance, don't want to be around the person anymore. And the idea is you're going to go in two different directions and you will have your own lives. And that is what happens for some of my clients. But if you have kids, you've got that additional consideration, because if you have kids that are still at home, especially if they're school age, younger, there's going to be some kind of co-parenting relationship, most likely. Even if you're in distant locations, you have to figure out, how are we sharing responsibility for these children? How are we going to provide for visitation? How are we providing for their needs? How are we making decisions for them? And all of that has to be dealt with over the course of the rest of their lives as minor children, at least. Things like who'll pay for health insurance or college, things like that. And so really, I encourage folks to think about the fact that, yes, your boats, if you get divorced, are going to leave the island separately, and you're going to have your own lives, and you might both even remarry or find somebody new. But to the extent you have kids, they're kind of like a tether between the two ships. You're going to be going somewhat in the same direction, at least to the extent that you are trying to make it easier or harder to share the kids and for kids to have equal time. I've got one couple I'm working with or I'm working with the husband, and they sold their house and moved into the same apartment complex. And so the kids are at one apartment some nights and the other apartment other nights, and they're just right around the corner. They were able to work that out really well. Others live down the street, but had a difficult time, even though they're just down the street. Co-parenting was tough. And then if either party is moving or has to move, it creates another additional level of complication.